would you please tell us the findings of your research?
那么 Lisa，你可以简单给我们介绍一下你最近的研究结果吗？
So I'm still in the process of researching, but so far I've conducted some focus groups and interviews, specifically with immigration attorneys in Texas. And a couple of interesting findings that I have. First, a lot of immigration law and resources are very word of mouth. It's very specific from one migrant to another migrant, and there's not really an aggregate of resources available.
Gotcha.
那么 Alyssa，首先她的第一个研究结果呢，就是说在和许多的移民律师以及税务律师讨论之后呢，她发现移民法律里面有很多都是非常针对于个体的移民，而对他们整个的集体来讲没有那么详细的介绍，所以每个人的情况可能都大有不同。
The second, through the EOIR, the Executive Office for Immigration Review data that's available, we can see again how important legal representation is. Even in just preparing your paperwork, filing that I-589 form, filing any of the paperwork, because blanks and very slight deviations, maybe a date is slightly off or a time or even a translation might be off, will affect your interview or your case.
So, Elisa, I want to ask you, in your experience, I'm sorry, Victor's going to translate first, sorry.
那么 Alyssa 的第二个研究结果呢，就是说从 EOIR 他们移民局给出的数据来看呢，当你拥有一个移民律师的时候，你获得政治避难的几率是要大大增加的。因为当你在写作这些文件，还有上交比如说 I-895表格的时候，里面任何一个数据的缺失，或者说时间呀，以及翻译的不一样，都会导致你申请的时候成功率的变化。
Right. So as Victor said, having a lawyer is extremely important. So in your experience, Elisa, like a lot of these applicants looking for political asylum, they might not have the resources available to hire a high-end lawyer like a high-end immigration, right? A high-end immigration lawyer that is capable of providing that high caliber level of, service needed to successfully navigate through the asylum process. So in your experience, and I can provide our audience resources that I know on my end in New York, but on your end, is there two questions. Is there any reputable organizations that you found that our audience can reach out to be able to obtain a directory of like legal representation in their area, whether it be Texas or in New York or California or wherever it is across the nation? And then number two, in your experience, if you do go the private route, let's just say an immigrant does have the means to go the private route. I don't know if you know the answer to this, but in your experience, how much would that typically cost? I think that would be of interest to our audience as well. So, Victor?
那么 Angel 刚刚讲呢，就是说在很多的情况下，这些申请政治避难的人，他们没有足够的资源或者说金钱来找一个这样的律师。那么在我们这边呢，我们会提供在纽约的移民律师，他们拥有很高的声誉，以及帮助人成功的几率。那么对于 Alyssa 来说，那么您那里有没有您所相信、您所信赖的律师在德克萨斯州或者在纽约以及全国范围内？那么第二个紧接着的问题就是说，从一个金钱的角度来讲，那么我们如果走一个这样的个人律师，个人去找一个律师来申请这条路的话，那么大概需要花多少钱呢？
Okay, so first, the first place that you can start off is, of course, EOIR.gov. Their website does have resources, a list of lawyers, as well as pro bono and low bono attorneys. Obviously, this is kind of hit or miss as to whether or not you get a really quality attorney, but it is a good way to check because they also have a list of attorneys that are that can't represent you, that might present themselves as an immigration attorney, but they can't actually represent you in the immigration court because of ethics problems usually.
Mm-hmm.
And then also a really important point that I actually figured out through my research as well. You can find an immigration lawyer from anywhere. If the attorney's based in Los Angeles, they can still represent you in Texas or in New York. So because immigration law is a federal level law, location doesn't matter, except for maybe ease of communicating with that attorney if you actually want to go into their office. But they will typically show up to help regardless of where you are in the United States.
那么 Lisa 刚刚讲呢，就是说，首先你可以去 EOIR.gov 网站，他们呢会为您提供一些律师以及资源。当然了，它的质量因为没有因为你是不需要付钱的，所以它的质量是不被保证的。但是呢，里面可能还会有律师，因为一些个人或者说政治原因，他们当你被移到移民法庭的时候是不能为你出庭的。但是呢，总的来讲，即使是你个人寻找的律师，他们可以在全国的任意地方为你服务。你可以在加利福尼亚找一个律师，帮你在纽约完成这个申请过程。所以，当你是一个人寻找，以个人名义去请到的一个花钱的律师的时候，一切就会变得简单很多。
Another good place to start might also be the Asylum Seekers Advocacy Project. I think it's asylumadvocacy.org. Or in Texas, RAICES, RAICES, great organization that can help not only with helping you find that legal aid, but also other, potentially helping with work permits or housing and just kind of groundwork to get you started.
That's a great resource.
Alisa 刚刚补充的呢是，你可以去通过其他的渠道寻找这些帮助，比如说有 Asylum Seeker Advocacy Program。当你在德克萨斯州的时候，你还可以去 RAICES.com 的网站上去帮您找律师。他们不仅仅会帮您完成政治避难的申请过程，还会在完成之前，帮您找比如说工作许可呀，以及任何您所需要的，把这个过程变得更加完美的一些步骤。
As far as cost is concerned, for a private attorney that's not a part of the pro bono or low bono networks, it can be upwards of $10,000.
Okay.
That is just for preparing your asylum form, that I-589, preparing all of your other paperwork, because again, the burden of proof is on you, preparing you for the interview, getting any sort of medical records or mental health records, and translating, because everything has to be in English.
Mm-hmm.
So the baseline cost can be between $8,000 and $10,000. If you are denied in the affirmative process and you end up in immigration court, that of course those fees continue to go up from there.
Okay. Actually, that's not really bad for lawyers as in terms of cost, because in my experience, for any sort of like court appearances, you're looking at an upwards of $50,000 to $100,000. So $10,000, and I've also done some research, $8,000 to $10,000 seems to be the norm, and I think that's actually pretty decent. So yeah, I wouldn't balk at that at all. Go ahead.
那么 Lisa 刚刚说的呢，是在仅仅是寻找律师的方面，那么首先会有大约在$10,000左右的比如说帮你写 I-589这份文件以及为你准备面试啊，以及帮你调出你的医疗记录、你的心理健康记录，或者帮你翻译你所有需要的文件。那么这个其实像 Andrew 讲的一样，相对来讲是没有那么多的，因为可能在国内范围内 仅仅是寻找一个律师让他帮你出庭，可能就要达到$50,000或者甚至$100,000更多。那么相对来讲，网上说的一个平均$8000到$10,000左右是一个可以接受的范围内。
Right. And since Alicia and I are familiar in this topic, we're happy to give out referrals to anybody that wants to contact us. So I will leave Alicia's, and everybody knows our contacts, so feel free to reach out to us. So in connection with that, please, would you tell us about your research study and what you're seeking in terms of like your recruits and how our audience members may benefit you or reach out to you?
那么我们刚刚提到了 Alyssa 的研究成果，那么 Alyssa 你可以更多的讲一讲你现在的研究内容，以及你可能所需要的一些寻找的正在申请政治避难的人，你需要什么样的一个资源来帮你完成你的学习呢？
As I already mentioned, from all of the lawyers that I have spoken with, how people find them is through word of mouth. And I honestly am hoping, or actually I'm in the process of creating a resource website as well as a Facebook page that can highlight some of that EOIR data and give contacts, links out, so that people who are starting from scratch that might not have connections, that might not have that network set up, can access that. And so what I'm looking for is to interview people who have already gone through the asylum process so they can talk about how they prepared, what they brought with them, what they needed, and then who they utilized, what resources they utilized, kind of aggregate this information. To really hopefully, even if it's not in the end my space, to be able to direct people to resources, because just coming in on your own with no knowledge, it's a recipe for disaster.
Absolutely. I completely agree with that. But Victor, I'll let you translate. Go ahead.
Alyssa 刚刚说的呢，是在申请政治避难的过程中，其实有很多的申请过程以及准备工作，他的经验都是口口相传的。那么 Alyssa 现在做的呢，就是说他想要创建这样的一个网站以及一个Facebook page。它可以帮助别人，帮助那些寻找政治避难的人，他们获得更多的资源。那么，但是为了完成这个网站以及这个脸书网站，Alyssa 就需要采访那些已经获得政治避难的人，向他们去询问，让他们传授一些他们在这个过程中所获得的经验，以及他们在申请拿到政治避难过程中所得到的帮助。那么把这些所有东西都汇总在一起呢，它就可以创造一个这样的一个平台，让更多的人得到这样的帮助。因为从个人角度来讲，当你一个人没有任何的帮助去申请这个政治避难的过程，将会是非常艰难的。
Yes, and I think what you're doing is quite admirable, because basically you're trying to recruit people who have been successful in this entire process. My family and I personally are one of those people, and we're happy to help you, and hopefully those members of our audience who have successfully navigated through the political asylum process and have successfully obtained legal status, including up to citizenship, like my family and I have. Elisa would love to talk to you. That way she could create this wonderful database for future asylum seekers to like help them with their resources and whatnot. In the meantime, Alicia and I, we also have resources available. So like I said, reach out to us and we'll be happy to help and speak to anybody that requires it.
那么 Andrew 刚刚讲的呢，就是说Alyssa 现在所做的是一个非常令人尊敬的过程，它可以帮助更多的人得到政治避难的身份以及更多的东西。就比如说像 Andrew 他们家自己就经历了这个过程。那么从政治避难到得到身份，我们很乐意为您提供这样的帮助。那么我们会把您所需要的信息放在简介里面，并且我们会尽我们最大的可能来帮助 Alyssa 完成这样一个平台，为更多的人去提供他们所应得的帮助。
So my ultimate goal is to understand those factors for success, which so far I've been getting quite a bit from the immigration lawyers, but I really need the perspective of people who have been successful to talk through their experiences in hopes to help future people coming in to better understand the system from the migrant's perspective. Because I can tell you, the attorneys are very well read. They are constantly being updated on things that anybody seeking asylum currently, things can change literally overnight. Basically, an executive order might upend a whole aspect of the system.
Yeah, no, absolutely, and hopefully that has changed since 2020. But who knows, right? And I actually want to get into questions about that. So if you're willing, I have a few questions from our Chinese-speaking audience that we've polled, and they have quite a few concerns as well. So,
Alright. 那在我们问出一些可能我们的中国观众更加关心的问题之前呢，我们想要说的，像阿莱萨刚刚讲的是，他希望理解这个政治避难的过程，并且他这样一个评级或者他的一个评估标准到底是如何制定的。因为在他采访过的很多律师呢，都提到了关于政治避难的政策，它一直在改变，以及里面一些很多很细微的东西都在不停的变化。那么我们所需要的呢，就是为您提供这样的帮助，让这些资源它们都被整合在一起。那么接下来将进入我们的问题。
So thank you for that answer, and thank you for the wonderful translation. So for our Chinese-speaking audience, I would like to get to some of their questions, if you don't mind. So basically, since the new restrictions on asylum seekers imposed by the Trump administration, for instance, there was a restriction on work permits for asylum seekers where asylum seekers would have to wait to apply for a work permit for 1 year from the date they filed asylum instead of the usual 150 days. The rule also limits the employment authorization validity period to a maximum of 2 years and automatically terminates employment authorization when an applicant's asylum denial is administratively final. And the Remain in Mexico policy, safe third country agreements, last in, first out. What should we expect from the Biden administration?
那么首先第一个是一个非常长的问题，我们要提到从上一个时代开始，就是说，当川普领导的美国下，他提出了很多关于政治避难的政策，就比如说他对工作许可的给予标准变得更加的严格，同时还有更多的，比如说，对于一个寻求政治避难的人，他可能让他停留在墨西哥，而不是直接来到美国，还有我们刚才提到的 last in first out。对那些2018年以前所申请的人会有很大的不便，以及诸多的对于政治避难的雪上加霜这样的政策。那么在换时代之后，当拜登成为总统之后，我们可以对政治避难以及它的评估标准有任何的或者说不一样的期待吗？
So first, the Biden administration is making some major overhauls to USCIS, which the asylum offices are underneath. One of the big ones is funding. So he's put into his recommendations for the budget millions of dollars. I don't remember the exact amount, in hopes to add personnel, as that's one of the biggest things. Is every document, every form is kind of looked through, touched by human hands before it's accepted. In fact, one of the things he just added was if there is a recommendation for denial, they'll actually send out a notice that they may be denying. So they're asking for more evidence if you want to continue to pursue that case. Let's see. In terms of Remain in Mexico or the MPP policy, that's gone. Everyone is slowly being allowed through Mexico. Safe third country has also been revoked. Again, those are both executive orders. So the executive office at any point in time can say that it's not part of the law. It's not something that they're going to have to address through Congress. We can just take it back.
那么丽萨说的是呢，首先在拜登政府上台之后，我们可以得到的是很多的好消息。首先，他在 USCIS 这个部门，它里面包含了政治避难的部门，它往里面投资了100万级别的资源。那么这些钱会被分发到 不仅仅是那些需要政治避难的人所需要的资源，还有更多的是在整个过程中所需要的人力资源。那么这样的一笔投资会让这个过程变得更加的简单。那么另外呢，就是说，当你将要被拒绝的时候，他们会告知你，会有一些专人来告知你，让你上交更多的资源，以及把你自己的整个表格呀，以及所有的文件变得更加的好，相当于给你更多的宽容以及更多的机会。另外一边呢，这个停留在墨西哥的政策已经被改变了，那他们这些以前受到政策迫害的人可以慢慢的进入美国，而最高指令下达关于墨西哥停留在墨西哥的最高指令也已经被移除了。
As far as last in, first out, I'm not sure if that one is going to be revoked just because that was actually the policy for USCIS until 2014. So they're actually returning to it because of the backlog of over 500,000 asylum applications currently waiting.
Understood. Gotcha.
那么最后一点提到呢，就是说这个 last in first out 政策呢，可能还需要更多的时间我们才能看到有一些改变。因为这是从2014年就开始的一个政策，而且目前有50万寻求政治避难的人士正在等待他们受到面试的时间以及这个机会的来临，所以是一个很巨大的过程，可能会花费很多的时间。
So do we expect that last in go ahead.
Oh, sorry. If it's a question on last in, first out, go ahead, because I was going to address the work permit as well.
Oh, gotcha. So is the last in, first out, is that going to significantly affect the ability for Chinese political asylum seekers to successfully obtain asylum?
It's going to affect timing.
Timing, okay. So like on top, it's like on top of the 3-4 years, you think it's going to be an additional like a year, maybe like we're looking at 5 years now. Okay, but like we said, like last time, it could be a good thing, right? They get to stay for a little bit longer. So hey, it's not necessarily a bad thing.
那么在问到这个 last in first out 政策，我们说对于中国的寻求政治避难人士来讲，它有没有什么好处或者是坏处呢？Alyssa 的解释是，它的坏处就只会是在时间上面，因为可能从以前来说的，你需要等待更多的年份，3到4年，现在我们可能看到的是5年或者更多。但是在另一方面来讲呢，这段时间之内你可以停留在美国，所以它也不见得是一件完全的坏事。但是我们还是会因为这个年份，让很多人的寻求政治避难之路变得更加艰难。
So one of the lawyers that I talked to referred to this process now as the forever backlog. Migrants that are coming in now and actually within the last few months are being processed relatively quickly. Not all of them, but we've had quite a bit faster turnarounds, more like a few months to 6 months. For interviews, just for the interviews, not necessarily for the decisions. But those who have already been here a while might still end up waiting. However, if you do have a good immigration attorney and you're willing to try, you can expedite the interview.
Right, that's right. And I mean, I think the conclusion to all of this is get a good immigration attorney because they can help expedite everything. They can make everything simpler. They can just like guide you through this entire process. And as a lawyer myself, I completely advocate for your position on that because a good lawyer makes a difference between a winning case and a losing case. Even if you have a weak case and you have a good lawyer, you will have a much stronger case than someone with a strong case and a weak lawyer. Correct?
Yeah.
那么他们刚刚讲的呢，就是说在 Alyssa 和一个律师最近的谈论当中呢，可能之前受到 last in first out 影响的这些寻求政治避难人士会成为一个永久性的后备。 那么对于现在申请的人呢，你可能需要几个月的等待来等到你的面试时间，你的面试机会。但是那么最关键的一点呢，就是如果你有一个好的移民律师的话，还可以加速你整个过程，并且提高你的成功率。而像 Angel 他自己本身就是一个律师，当你有一个很好的律师，那么即使你寻求政治避难，或者是任何在法庭上面所拥有的文件没有那么强的时候，你的好律师也会帮你提高你成功的几率。
One of the things I want to point out to that is during your consultation with the lawyer, you want to make sure that they are explaining the process to you, that they're not just handing you a story or trying to shift your actual what happened to you, why you're seeking asylum. Your narrative of persecution and being able to repeat it and be consistent with it is vital for that asylum interview or hearing in an immigration court.
Alyssa 刚刚讲的就是说，很重要的一点，当你寻求律师的时候，他会是你的一个顾问一样的存在。但是你自己作为寻求政治避难人士，你需要了解整个申请过程，而且你需要自己清楚的知道你自己的故事，以及你自己寻求这个政治避难的理由，而不是一味的听从你律师对你所说的东西。
So I guess my issue with that, Lisa, is like my thinking with the experience in the Chinese speaking community is they probably, like, for me, I would be the one to go along with my family friend, or my like friend even, to go along with them to be able to find the right lawyer, because I can get on the phone and I can be able to discern who's a good lawyer, who's not a good lawyer. But for 90% of the people out there, it's impossible to tell, right? So like, and especially if there's a language barrier, right? Like, so like, is there a resource, or is there somebody out there that can kind of be like your not just your translator, but your like person that'll guide you through the process? Like, is there number one, is there someone that can do it for pro bono? And number two, does something like that even exist? And number three, can we hire them as in a private setting, if not a public setting? Because I think most Chinese speaking people would need that, unless they have someone in their life that already knows how to navigate through the system, and I don't think they have that.
那么 Angel 刚刚讲呢，就是说，那对于他来说呢，如果他认识任何人需要这样的帮助，那么 Angel 作为一个律师，他就有足够的背景知识来判断他是否能找到一个好的移民律师。但是对于很多的中国人士，尤其是寻求政治避难人士来说，无论是语言障碍啊，或者说是对整个文化的不了解，那么对于他们来说非常难找到这样一个好的律师来帮助他们走过整个这样一个过程。那么他想问的就是说，有没有这样的一个资源，或者说这样的一个知识库、信息库存在，能让我们首先找到这样的一个好律师，帮助我们去了解整个申请政治避难的过程，同时这样的律师或者说这样帮人寻找整个了解这个过程的资源是否存在。那么如果他们存在的话，第三个问题是，我们是否能找到这样的一个人，把它当做个人资源来使用，还是说它会是一个像刚才提到的网站上面所提供的对公众开放的资源？
That is a question that I've often asked myself as well. If there is this, my understanding in terms of looking for a lawyer, if they don't feel like you are proficient in English enough to complete the interview and go through the process, they should be reaching out for an interpreter for you. But again, I don't know if there's this sort of intermediary. I know the advocacy groups and some of the resource groups have great networks and will reach out. They'll utilize their social media to find people who are willing to do translations, who are willing to come in. But there's not, again, asylum resources. There's just not one place.
Interesting. Huh. Interesting. All right. So maybe that's where you can come in, Elisa.
Yeah.
Okay.
那么 Lisa 刚刚讲呢，就是说她经常也问到自己这个问题，就是说有没有这样一个中间人的存在，可以帮助所有人去加速并且增大他们得到政治避难的机会。因为你经常所遇到的问题就是说，你找到一个律师，这个律师觉得你可以有寻求政治避难的机会，但是由于这个申请人不会说中文，那这个律师在这个时候就需要帮助他去找到一个无论是翻译官或者是关系网里面的任何人来帮助他完成这个过程。那么我们现在目前所看到的呢，是在政治避难的这个过程中，没有一个这样大的关系网来帮助所有人完成这个过程。那么可能这就是Alyssa 所想要创造的一个这样的网站以及这样的一个知识库。那么我们希望这个过程可以非常的顺利，这样更多人可以获得更多的帮助。
Right. And our end, we plan to like compile a list of attorneys that we know in New York for our audience. So that's what we're trying to we'll try to do in our description for our when we air. And any resources that you have in addition to everything that you mentioned, please send it to us, and then we'll also include it into our description as well.
那么就我们来讲呢，我们会在这一期视频上传的时候，在简介里面放入一系列我们所认为值得信赖的移民律师来帮助您完成这个过程。那么我们也欢迎大家在评论区踊跃的给出他们所拥有的资源，来帮助更多的人获得一个更好的生活。
So before we get too far from the first question that had multiple parts, I do want to address the work permit.
Okay.
So there is currently a case, Casa v. Marcaris. It's the current head of DHS, I believe, in Maryland. It's already been successful through appeals.
Okay.
That the year is too high of a burden. And we can all agree that a year is too long of a time to not be able to work and support your family.
Correct.
But again, for those people in the middle of that situation, I would strongly advise them check out asylumadvocacy.org.
Okay.
那么 Lisa 刚刚讲呢，就是说，首先这个工作许可拿到工作许可中间需要等待的1年时间是完全没有道理的长，因为当你在1年时间不工作，并且想要尝试去养活自己或者说养活自己的家庭，是一件非常困难的事情。而在政府方面，他们在对这个政策进行他们所力所能及的改变。对，目前就是这样。